Good day, two-wheel friends. Zack here with RevZilla, and welcome to another episode of Daily Rider. Our guest today is the 2024 Yamaha YZF-R1. That is a 450-pound, 1,000cc showroom superbike. It makes the better part of 200 horsepower and costs nearly $20,000. It was built to be fast and racy and look even faster and racier, and not to be particularly accommodating when it comes to riding to work. But here's the thing, even if you don't know much about motorcycles, you've probably heard of an R1. It's a famous name for Yamaha and for the two-wheel world in general. So on the ride to work today, we'll talk about what makes the Yamaha R1 good, what makes it legendary, and why it might be going away sometime soon. Buckle up, everybody. It's superbike time. Okie dokie, everybody. Before we get going here with this R1 Daily Rider, a friendly reminder that this episode is brought to you by RevZilla. RevZilla is not just a YouTube channel that you're watching, it is also a company that sells parts, accessories, and apparel for motorcycles and people who love them. Every dollar you spend at RevZilla.com on a helmet, a jacket, tires, saddlebags, whatever it might be, some of that money gets shifted over to produce videos like this, Daily Rider, and the Shop Manual with Eric Henning, CTXP Adventures, and the High Side, Low Side podcast. We hope you ride safe. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Alrighty, everybody. Let's start with the engine on the R1, shall we? This is the now famous 998cc cross-plane inline-four. I don't have a whole lot of time to go into why this engine is different, but very basically, instead of the inline-four cylinders going up and down like this, like they do on a CBR 1000 or a ZX10 or something like that, all four cylinders go up at different times. They are 90-degree offset on the crank pin, each one of them. That's why you get that really special growl from this engine, and a bunch of other characteristics as well, including slightly heavier crankshaft and some downsides the Yamaha's been fighting both in World Superbike and MotoGP, but that is sort of a different podcast. The point is, you'll hear it sounds very unique, and I'll talk about why it's special to ride and where it came from. Once we get going, that is. Other than that, it's fairly basic superbike architecture. You got an aluminum twin spar frame here and sort of a longish swing arm for good mechanical grip when you're on a racing track. It's fairly basic suspension on this base R1. There's an R1M with Öhlins electronic suspension. This has a KYB fork and shock, which are fully adjustable, but nothing too kind of like exotic. The same goes for the braking components. These are Advix calipers. I think they're 320 mil rotors. Steel braided lines, though the calipers and the master cylinder are sort of like nothing special. It's sort of an everyman superbike in some ways, especially this standard R1. It's not particularly exotic. It has nice big brakes, and it has fully adjustable suspension, and it has a TFT dash, as we'll talk about, but it's not in the same echelon with some European superbikes and even some other options from Japan that are particularly spicy, or even its fraternal twin, the R1M, which has carbon fiber bodywork and a whole bunch of fancy jazz. This iteration of the R1 debuted as a 2015 model and was updated in 2020 to have slightly different bodywork up front here. I think this piece is a little bit wider. This was reshaped a little bit. It's a little bit more blunt and sort of like swoopy at the front than it used to be. And there's some other small updates as well. It was updated for emissions regulations in 2020. This piece used to be aluminum and is now titanium. There's now engine braking adjustments in the electronics, which we can dive into a little bit later. So it was little tweaks in 2020. Largely, it's the same bike that it was in 2015 when it sort of turned the superbike world on its head a little bit. We'll talk about more of that once we get going here. But let's fire up that famous engine and fire up this TFT screen here in the R1's dash. Whoa, hey, stay on. All right, here we go, everybody. Yeah. That sound all by itself makes me excited. And I was able to take it to a track day. You'll see the tires are more used than they might be from riding them on the street. If you're riding on the street and your tires look like this, you're going too fast. Go to the track. That's a little Daily Rider PSA for you. All right, everybody. Let's do it, shall we? YZF-R1 on the way to work. Alrighty, first up, some specifications as usual. I said that the R1 cost nearly $20,000, which is a bit of an exaggeration. MSRP for 2024 is $18,400, I believe. On the Daily Rider scales, with a full 4.5 gallons of gas in the tank, it weighed in at 452 pounds. And the seat height is 33.7 inches, which is a pretty high seat height. Might be surprising, but that's often the case with showroom sport bikes. You want the seat height to be nice and high for on-track capability. As for horsepower, I think I said something like it makes the better part of 200 horsepower. If you Google how much horsepower does an R1 have, you're going to see numbers like 197 and 198. If you look at an actual dyno chart for rear wheel horsepower, it's going to be closer to 170 is my guess. The reason I didn't list it in the specifications is that there isn't technically a claimed number from Yamaha, I don't think, not in the United States at least. And you know, when the numbers get that big, it's honestly not that important. It's a lot. It's a lot of horsepower. It's really fast. Watch this. Enough of that. We can rejoin our regularly scheduled programming and talk about ergonomics. The ergonomics are, let me see, they're bad. It's uncomfortable. It's not a comfortable motorcycle at all. And I'll start with the really obvious stuff. The foot pegs are fairly high. You know, it was a track bike. The seat is fairly high, as I mentioned. The handlebars are really, really low. They're only maybe an inch or maybe an inch and a half above the height of the seat. So practically you're reaching down to the height of the seat when you reach forward to the bars. The R1 is typically better for taller riders in general, such as myself at 6'2". I think it fits me pretty well for a superbike, but it can be kind of stretched out for shorter riders because the reach from the bars to the center of the seat is historically a little bit farther than most of the competition. So very basically, what does all that mean, Zach? Why is it so uncomfortable? Well, that just means all the weight is on your wrists. It doesn't take very long of riding around on city streets or basically whatever environment that you're going to find yourself just feeling a lot of pressure on the palms of your hands and on your wrists. It's very common to see sport bike riders going down the freeway with one elbow on the tank, and that's because their wrists hurt. And it's totally understandable because the ergonomics of this motorcycle were designed to go around a racetrack, not designed to be comfortable. All of that being said, the R1 is quite lovely in some other ergonomic ways. One of my favorites is the junction between the tank and the seat. I don't know if you can, I'm pointing my helmet down. I don't know if you can see that, but it's really, really smooth. That means that when you're on a racetrack hustling yourself around, it's just like really easy to feel like you can hold onto the tank with your legs, and everything is sort of, all the shapes down there are sort of gentle and organic, and that allows your body to fit into the bike really nicely. I also think that the seat is pretty comfortable, actually. It's fairly thin, but I think the foam is a sort of nice material, and it's nice and wide and fairly supportive considering what the bike is. And maybe it's because my wrists hurt so much that I don't think about the seat really. It's actually surprisingly accommodating in some ways, though the basic foundation was not designed for this at all. The 2020 update I mentioned to the fairing was supposed to make for less wind buffeting at full tuck though, so you have to go like this on the R1 to really feel the effects of it. And I look like a complete idiot going down the highway now. But yeah, someone on Instagram said, you know, can you feel the difference of the new fairing? Absolutely not. There's really not very much wind protection when you're just riding around, you know? And even if there were a little bit less buffeting, I don't think it would really register on your brain. One thing the R1 delivers in spades in situations like this is smoothness from the engine. The engine is so incredibly smooth. I remember having that feeling the first time I rode this iteration of this bike in January, I think, or February of 2015. I went to Australia to Sydney Motorsports Park and I rode the R1 and R1M for the first time. And I remember just going out of pit lane onto the track and I spun the engine up and I thought, wow, it's so buttery smooth. And it absolutely does that. I mean, cruising along at this speed right now, the engine's really smooth at 4,500 RPM. If I go down to, I don't know, second gear, and now I'm at 8,500 RPM, going 70 miles an hour, and the engine's still pretty smooth. It doesn't really care. It could do this all day, it feels like. But you won't want to do that all day because even riding it sort of normally, you get pretty bad gas mileage. I think my high number was 35, my low was 29. So it's good that it has a 4.5 gallon tank because range isn't great. I was out on a photo shoot with my colleague Dustin and we ran this thing all the way out of gas. Poor Dustin had to push with a little bit of my help to a gas station with 128 miles on the clock. That's not much. So yeah, a touring bike, it is not. But it does have that really gentle, smooth beating heart, which is why the MT10 exists. Because everyone's like, oh, I just want that engine, but I want it in like a naked bike that's more upright and comfortable and still gets terrible gas mileage. And Yamaha said, no problem, we can do it. But of course, the MT10, a whole nother episode of Daily Rider. If you want to learn about the MT10, you can look that one up. On our last little section of freeway here, we can talk about mirrors, which are surprisingly good. I mean, they're nice and smooth. They're not positioned particularly well. You still get like a really good view of your lower arm and a little hard to see behind you, but they are smooth, just like the engine, and probably in part because of the engine. So riding an R1 around town like this, it's a fairly polite, easy bike to use, but it's not very good at this for a few reasons. One is the riding position, which I don't find very easy to sort of like look around and have good situational awareness. Classic sport bike problem. This bike's geared really, really tall, as big super bikes often are. You can see like you slip the clutch until 15 or 20 miles an hour probably. As far as the throttle response and the clutch feel and stuff like that, it's really good. It's a sweet engine to use, and all the controls feel very precise and thoughtful in a way that they should for a bike that is, you know, a flagship. But really it's just sort of like hemmed in for what it's meant to do. The bike will go 99 miles an hour indicated in first gear, so it's not happy when it's doing this. It acts docile enough, and it's happy to help, but yeah, you know, the bars are narrow, the gearing is tall, the riding position is uncompromising. If you're doing this for any amount of time, you're going to wish you were on a twisty road or a freeway on-ramp or something. So yeah, ultimately the urban riding report on the R1 is that it's not great, but you do look awesome. You look like you've just barely rolled out of a World Superbike paddock, and the bike nearly sounds the same too. It's got this beautiful menacing growl, and you know, you feel pretty cool riding around on the legend that is the R1, I would say. Just got to get your clutch slipping down, you know. Okie doke, Lover's Lane. You can probably guess how the passenger accommodations are on this bike. They are, if anything, even more uncompromising than the rider's position. The passenger foot pegs are super high back there. It's just this narrow, tiny little perch, sort of afterthought of a seat. My wife often actually brings this motorcycle up because she has some experience with it. I had one as a long-term test bike way back when for about 4,000 miles in the better part of a year. I club raced it, so on and so forth. She spends some time on it, and she often brings this bike up still. She says, well, at least it's not as uncomfortable as that R1. I think you'll find your passengers will have a similar opinion. I wouldn't expect them to be happy, but maybe, you know, if they're an adrenaline junkie, they'll get a kick out of it. Alrighty, we go into the twisty road section, and of course this is where everyone will have you believe the R1 is magical, and it sort of is. I guess I'll start with the things that I like broadly about it, which is that going through turns is what it was designed to do to some extent, and it is sweet. You get a little bit of body English, like you get one butt cheek off the inside of the seat, and your hands can be really neutral on the bars, just sort of like floats through the corners. It's very responsive. The suspension is pretty stiff, so you get lots of feedback, which I like on a racetrack. But speaking of racetracks, that's really where the bike belongs. It's really rare that you can find a public road that really suits the R1, that's like smooth enough or open enough. And if it is open enough, you're going to find yourself going triple-digit speeds pretty soon, and at that point you shouldn't be doing that. You should be going to a racetrack anyway. It is good on a twisty road, but I just don't think it's better on a twisty road than something that's upright and more playful. You know, I mean, like if you asked me to have as much fun as possible going down this little, you know, whatever, 1 or 2 mile section of daily rider route, and you said, which bike do you want? The R1 wouldn't be very high up the list. I'd have an MT10 first. I might even have an MT09 first. That's just sort of like emblematic of how high performance this bike is. It really just sort of needs a purpose-built closed circuit to be flexed and used in a way that it deserves. If you ask me what bike I want to go around a racetrack as fast as I can, yeah, this bike could be near the top of the list. It's so sweet. When I took it to the track day a couple days ago, I just was reminded how easy it is to use. It just like wants to help you go faster. Even the electronics are 10 years old now, and they're still good, still state of the art, still like phenomenally comprehensive suite of electronics that just work so well. Wheelie control that feels like it was designed yesterday by BMW. It's really, really good. The traction control and slide control just offers so much adjustability and so much confidence to the rider. It's a phenomenally good motorcycle when you really ask it to scream. Right, back onto surface streets here. I don't know if you can see the tachometer turns green at a certain RPM. What is it? It's I think it's 8,000. Yeah, it's not a huge dash. It feels a little bit dated sometimes. We'll talk more about it in a minute here, but functionally it's pretty nice. Got everything you need, and it's laid out in a pretty easy to use way, I think. Talking about the R1's sporting capability, as we approach this red light, you have to talk about the brakes, which in this situation, you roll up to a stoplight here, you jump on the binders, really strong, big calipers, big discs. They feel really strong, they feel sharp, and not as much initial bite as you get from a Ducati or a BMW with a Brembo system maybe, but good brakes. On a racetrack, however, you start really hammering the brakes lap after lap and you're a good rider, you'll get the brakes to fade a little bit, and that's been a weak point of the R1 since this version came out anyway. It doesn't have ultra high spec brakes, and like I said, the brakes are good. I just think they're not as good as the rest of the bike, which is a high bar, but it's a bar that the bike has set, and it's hard not to hold the brakes to that standard. All right, as we approach this stoplight here, let's talk about that dash a little bit more, shall we? It is a, no geez, I don't remember the number, 3.8 inch TFT, 4 inch maybe. It feels small, I'll say that. It looks small inside the bubble there, and it feels like it's fairly far away. It's a nice layout though. There's a lot of information in there. There's gear position indicator here. There's this is the IMU, and the ECU is reading, well, there's a brake pressure thing here, you can see right there. When I squeeze the brake lever, you get brake pressure readout. You also get G-forces front and rear read out there. And then this little click wheel over here will run through these parameters here, which right now we're setting air temp of 80, coolant temp of 204. You can look at fuel averages, odometers, trips, stuff like that. All the information on the bottom is controlled with this button here, where you can, when you're stopped anyway, go through 4 different power modes, A, B, C, and D. And there are corresponding power maps for each one of those, as well as traction control settings, slide control, and engine braking management. To get into the whole kit and caboodle, you hold down on this little click wheel here, go down to YRC setting, and then you can adjust all this stuff. Wheelie control, engine braking, brake control, ABS, quick shifter, launch control, blah, blah, blah. The graphics are a little bit Game Boy compared to some of the other kind of like classier dash on like a Panigale or an S1000RR, but ultimately the information is laid out nicely, and it's pretty easy to use. I like it. And when you're having fun on a bike, you're not looking at the dash all that much anyway, right? Maybe? I don't know. Maybe I'm just making excuses. Right about now, we can talk about whether or not you buy this bike for the engine, and the R1 is one of those bikes that, yes, absolutely. If someone said, I just got an R1 because I want that cross-plane growl and I want that sound and that feel, and that's the only reason I got the bike. I don't really like the way it looks. I don't really like this. The other bikes have this, other bikes have that, but I wanted that engine. I would say great decision. Great decision. It's a phenomenal engine, and it's unique. No other brand has an engine that sounds like this or feels like this, and it's not currently benefiting Yamaha a great deal in MotoGP, for example, where the Yamaha factory is struggling mightily. But I think for a street bike, you know, this bike and the MT-10, the engine is special, undeniably. While we're at the stoplight, I can point out that we've been here for 60 seconds or 90 seconds, something like that, and the coolant temp is up to 222 Fahrenheit, and it'll probably get a little higher before we leave here. There it goes up to 226. It's not uncommon to have the coolant temp jump to 225 or 230, even 235, which is very hot. Yamaha clearly designed it to run hot because it works well when the engine's hot. It's not as bad as the old undertail exhaust bikes, pre-2015 bikes, I don't think. It's not quite as much heat as that, but it burns a lot of gas, it makes a lot of heat. It's a hot rod, ultimately. And it's very gentlemanly and polite to ride around in environments like this, like I've been doing this whole ride. But underneath the hood there is a hot rod. So, where do we sit with this R1 in the history of R1s, in the history of motorcycling? I said that it might be going away soon, and that is true in Europe. I think starting in 2025, there will be no street R1 option. I think there'll be a track-only option, maybe. In the United States market, the R1 will continue in 2025, is what Yamaha is saying right now as of the recording of this video. The point is, there are definitely questions around the future of the motorcycle, because Yamaha has chosen in Europe, for example, not to update the emissions technology to keep up with the demand, and it is a hot rod, like I said. And so that puts some question marks, officer. Put some question marks around the bike and where it will be in a few years, or 5 years, or 10 years. You know, like, it could just be sort of the waning moon of the R1. It could be in its twilight years. And that's a little sad for the world of motorcycling, I think, because on the one hand, I totally get it. It's not a good street bike. It's not practical for consumers to use, especially when there are other options that do some things just as well and other things much better. But from an emotional standpoint, anyone who's been into motorcycles, or especially racing or sport bikes or whatever in the past 10 years, will be really sad if the R1 goes away. It's sort of like a stalwart, it's a staple, it's a legend. And without it, the world of two wheels might feel a little bit different. A little bit slower, perhaps. The thing that I would like to really iterate, and perhaps reiterate, is that I can't believe how modern this bike feels. I wondered, after riding recent Ducatis, recent BMWs, a Honda CBR 1000 RRR, would it just feel long in the tooth? But it doesn't. It feels relevant on the track and off the track. It feels good. It feels like a superbike you'd be proud to buy and own, even though it hasn't really been updated in so long. It says a lot about how good this bike was 10 years ago. It really does. And for those of you wondering how it goes as a dirt bike, well, the R1's never been famously good in the dirt, but maybe today's the day. I'm gonna go to Power Map 3, which is gonna tame it a little bit. And then, can I shut off traction control here? I can. Traction control off, slide control off. Engine braking management, I don't know. I'm gonna leave ABS on. I don't think you can shut it off, actually. So I remember when I raced this bike, I had to leave it on. Okay. Yamaha R1, no traction control. See how we do in the dirt. The gearing is so ridiculous. It's just going faster than I want to go already. I'm not even doing anything yet. You know, it's not that bad so far. Although this sort of like sandy surface is not great for the old RS11 Hypersport tires. Well, there's a big mound here. We should build another jump, huh? What do you think? Okay, let's see what happens if we get on it a little bit here. Okay. That's a pretty angry noise, isn't it? There's some bumps. Oh my gosh. That's I think ultimately I would not recommend that, is what I think. I'm going to turn traction control back on. There we go. So it's back on. I'm going to go into the menu and make sure that we're in mode B here. Let's do wheelie control off. I don't normally shut wheelie control off just because it's so impressive and badass on this bike. I just sort of leave it on because doing big honking wheelies isn't really like the thing that this bike does well in my opinion, but we'll give it a try. Why not? Okay, can the R1 do a wheelie? Yeah, probably. Jesus. Yeah, it can do wheelies, but like by the time you're really doing a good one, you're going so fast. My goodness. Ugh, what an engine. I mean, it feels sort of like strong and willing and vibrant, but calm and smooth below 8,000 RPM. And then when you get to 8,000 RPM, it just does this thing where it just sort of like clears its throat like an opera singer and starts going, and it sends this like godly noise, and the push in the back you get is phenomenal. It's not really even one of the fastest superbikes anymore. It's sort of like often panned for not being as fast as a BMW or a Ducati or an Aprilia or whatever. But gosh, is it sweet. And it's plenty fast. So the question of can you back it in is an interesting one on the R1, because yes, you can. There we go. And that's with ABS on. The engine braking is quite aggressive, and that means that when you jump on the brakes really hard, I'm not even touching the back brake. It's just like doing this all itself. It's pretty exciting. And on the track, I actually found that the new engine braking management options are good, because I found the standard engine braking was a little bit too strong. So I turned it down a little bit, which, yeah, it's nice update. But for hooning around on the street, I suppose it's kind of fun. Well, now, there are no blank parking spaces for us to work with here, so we're just gonna have to wing it. I'm gonna line up right here. You're on this line. We are gonna crank it to the left, feet up. Oh God. Oh man, this is really not good at this. Oh God. Oh God. 2.5. 2.5 in an extremely ugly pass at a U-turn. U-turns are not the R1's speciality. Let me just say that. If you get good at U-turns on an R1, you'll probably be pretty good at them in general. All right. Happy enough to have survived the dirt road shortcut. Let's give one more listen to this sweet, sweet engine. I mean, the neighbors probably hate me, but is that not just a magical sound for an engine to make? God, it's good. Okay, Instagram question time. First up is the disgruntled panda, who says, how different is it really from an MT10 SP? So different. Really, really, really very different. The MT10 is a very different animal. The engine is different, though it sounds and feels similar. The gearing is different. The tuning is different. It just feels completely different as a motorcycle. There's way more legroom. You're way more upright, and that makes it more comfortable, but it also makes it feel, you know, less sporty. And the MT10 is a particularly comfortable, relaxed, upright sport naked. It is not like a BMW S1000 single R or a Tuono V4 or something like that, which really feels like just kind of a naked version with a slightly higher bar of the superbike. So it's not really similar, except in the few ways that it is. If you would like to read my review, both on a racetrack and on the road of the MT10 SP, that exists at RevZilla.com/common-tread for what it's worth. Next up is Neil Dan and Rage Seas, who had sort of a back and forth here that I saved because I thought it was pretty good. Neil Dan says, is the R1 still the premier Japanese superbike, or would you rather have a Kawi ZX-10 or Suzuki GSR-1000? Rage Seas replied and said, what about the Honda CBR RRR? We've already seen it on the Daily Rider. How would it compare to Leaderboard? We'll get into the Leaderboard here in a minute. I appreciate this question, though. And like I said at the end of the ride, I think this bike is surprisingly relevant. I think if I were to choose any of those bikes, I'd be tempted by the Honda just because it's so exotic and has such an amazing howl. But I don't know, I feel at home on this bike. And maybe it's because I have a little bit more experience with it. Though I've ridden ZX-10s and GSR-1000s and Honda CBR-1000s, I've ridden all of them. This bike just sort of like, even though it's not exotic, it feels a little bit more special. And I just love how it feels on a racetrack. It's great. It fits me well, being fairly tall, like I said. And I just think it sounds so sweet and it works so well. Feels weird to pine after the one that hasn't been updated in 10 years, but that's what I'm doing. Next question is from Mark Craver, who says, as a frequent track rider enthusiast, I am looking for one bike to commute with, take to the track, and mountain runs on the weekend. Is this the bike for me? No, I don't think so. I don't know. I would get this bike if you're going to go to the track like 90% of the time. In fact, if you're going to ride on the street at all, I just think there are other options. I don't know. It's hard to recommend to use for a weekend riding or to commute. It's just really hard to recommend. I don't think it's very good at that. It is sweet. It is special. It does feel somewhat legendary when you ride it, but it feels definitely uncomfortable. I think if you want to do part-time track days with your street bike, I would go with a Tuono. I would go with a BMW S1000 Single R. It's pretty wicked. Triumph Street Triple 765. I don't know, something like that. That's what I'd probably end up recommending for you. Next question is from Corey Baker 5004, who says, with the current R1 going on 10 years old, is it better described as long in the tooth or timeless classic? If I had to go binary there, I go timeless classic. It's still good. And the fact that it's still good means that it was excellent when it was new. And that says everything you need to know. Is it long in the tooth? Maybe. But for riders like you and me, and we're going to the track, it's great. It's great. It's a timeless classic, Corey. Last question comes from JStock315, who says, if there were to be a swan song for this bird set for pasture, what would it be? So you're setting this thing out to pasture. If there were a swan song for the R1, what would it be? I think that's the question. And that's a good question. I think if I'm picking a song, I'm going with, there's a song called You're Gonna Miss Me When I'm Gone. I think that's the song. That's the song that I would assign for the R1. Was it No, it's like it's country, I think. Maybe it's Brooks and Dunn had a song about, you've hurt me too many times and you're going to miss me when I'm gone. You better kiss me one more time. That's the song that I imagine the R1 singing to all of us plebes at track days and canyon roads, trying to extract the most out of it. And the R1 is saying, you're going to miss me when I'm gone. I've tried to love you, but you're not good enough for me in the end. We will miss this motorcycle if and when it goes away. But for those of you in the United States, you don't have to worry. It's not going away yet. It's still available to shred track days and make your wrists hurt on a commute. Let's put this sucker on the Daily Rider leaderboard and we can call it a day. All right.
Okay, team. Here we are at the Daily Rider leaderboard. As a friendly reminder, you got the KTM 890 SMT at the top there, Moto Guzzi V100 Mandello, and a BMW M1000R on the podium. No superbikes, you might have noticed. This is the first superbike we've ridden in 2024. So where's the Honda CBR 1000 RRR SP? All the way at the bottom, almost all the way at the bottom. Not worse than a Sondor's Metacycle, because nothing could be worse than that. But basically at the bottom of the 2023 Daily Rider leaderboard. Wicked impressive bike, but just not a good daily rider. But we've got a Yamaha R1, which gets a little fire logo, spicy, quite a fast motorcycle. So they're high performance bikes, like the BMW M1000 Single R, which is very, very fast, claims more horsepower than a Yamaha R1, and in some ways feels like it, but also fairly upright and just an awfully sweet bike to use, which is why it's so high up on the board there. And another sport bike here, the old Ninja 500 SE, which is a pretty dynamite daily rider actually, and a very different sport bike than a Yamaha R1, and a bit better, if we're being honest. Ninja 500 SE, I would happily recommend that bike be ridden across town to work any day of the week, whereas the R1 maybe not so much. So the R1's going to be down here somewhere. What do you think? Better than a Hyper 698 Mono from Ducati? I don't think so. I mean, the Hyper 698 is tall and yeah, it's a very kind of siloed bike. Like, it's good at one thing and not good at a lot of other things, but ultimately as uncomfortable and kind of rowdy and silly and not great on the highway a Hyper 698 is, probably a better daily rider, if we're being honest, right? Is a Harley-Davidson Nightster a better daily rider than a Yamaha R1? Whew. The R1 is such an interesting blend of things that I know are not good, and yet things that I love so much, like performance and speed, and the actual capability to back all of it up, which the R1 has in spades. It's so cool. You feel so cool riding that bike. But it's really not a very good daily rider. The Harley-Davidson Nightster has some issues. Didn't like the throttle response. The riding position is a little funky. You know, suspension is like short and a little bit lopsided, if I remember correctly. But then again, the Nightster is smooth. Would I prefer it? if those two bikes are sitting next to each other in the garage, I'm much more likely to recommend a Harley-Davidson Nightster. Well, okay, let's talk about the S2 Del Mar for a second, the Livewire S2 Del Mar fully electric motorcycle. And I remember saying, bit of a knife to a gunfight. All electric bikes are really hard on the Daily Rider leaderboard because they're so kind of like hemmed in by not being able to ride very far and having to wait for them to charge. And that is a really big blocker for many people's quote unquote daily riding parameters, you know? The Yamaha R1 is not really a knife to a gunfight. It's more like a bazooka to a gunfight. It's just so much more than you need, and it's kind of overwhelming in a bunch of ways, depending on the type of riding you're gonna do and the type of rider that you are. So where does the bazooka fit in the gunfight next to the knife? Whew, I'm so deep in the analogies here. Okay, everybody be cool. We're gonna put it on the Daily Rider leaderboard. It's gonna go where you might have expected. I do think that I would recommend a Harley-Davidson Nightster over an R1 for many, many people's daily ride. Many, many people. Myself, I would have trouble turning down the R1 because it just plucks at my heartstrings so much. And I love what it stands for, and I love its kind of status in the motorcycling world, and I love the way that it sounds, and I like the way that it makes me feel. And I know what it feels like to have slick tires on that bike and to bail into a corner and just know that the bike has your back and just let your knee and your elbows skim along the pavement, and not very many bikes can deliver that. It is special and contains some magic that I was not expecting to taste or see 10 years down the road from when it debuted, basically. But it's not a very good daily rider. There you have it. All right, everybody. Thank you for riding along with me on this daily ride and my old friend, the YZF-R1. I will be very sad if and when it finally goes away. Hopefully, you won't be too sad to see me go away now that we're at the end of the episode. Thank you for sticking around for this daily rider. Very much appreciate it, and hope to see you next time. See you, everybody.